Again, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on your geographical location. I'm David Goldman, Deputy Editor of Asia Times, and I'm thrilled and honored to bring to you the ultimate semiconductor industry insider, Dr. Handel Jones of International Business Services. In the great tech war between the United States and China, our theme today is the empire that is China strikes back. Dr. Jones has held senior positions in the semiconductor industry at major firms, and his consulting organization, International Business Services, advises top Wall Street firms, brokerage houses, venture capitalists, as well as many chief executive officers in the semiconductor industry. He has unparalleled access. So as we look at the cast of our Tech Wars program, talking to Dr. Jones is the next best thing to having Yoda on the program. He's the source of all wisdom. I've learned an enormous amount from him. Absolutely thrilled to have him. We will, as usual, have about half an hour of presentation, and then we'll open up to your questions. But I'd like to start, Dr. Jones, just by looking at the landscape as the Trump administration comes to what we presume is a close, though one never knows. We've had 3 years of American attempts to suppress China's efforts to become the dominant player in global telecommunications, mobile broadband, particularly 5G technology, and its many downstream applications. So tell us at the beginning, has the U.S. succeeded? Has it made a dent? Who's winning? How do you see this from the top down?
Well, thank you for having me. We study the industry very carefully. And before the travel restrictions, I used to go to China probably every 6 weeks. As David mentioned, we do work with a number of the major US companies. We also work with a number of the Chinese companies, but also companies in South Korea, companies in Europe. So we try and have a global perspective of what is going on. So from going to China probably about 15 years ago, maybe a little bit before that, and today, at the beginning, China was clearly very backward in terms of understanding technology, having access to technology. Around 2010, things started to change, and there was an acceleration, many failures, some successes. In the 2015-2020 timeframe, there's been a significant change in terms of their technology positioning. And as David mentioned, 5G is obviously one area which is highly contentious. China was way behind in 2G. They were way behind in 3G. They tried to have their own protocol in 3G. They failed. 4G, they were late. But now 5G, they're ahead. So have the US efforts slowed them down? Have the US efforts hurt them? The US efforts have hurt them in certain areas in terms of restrictions to actually access to semiconductors. They have built an inventory of many key products. So there has not been a slowing of the building of the communications infrastructure, the selling of 5G smartphones. However, though, what the US administration has done is created an environment of crisis. And that actually is a positive for China. Now they have an identified clear enemy. Before, the US was a trading partner, high level of respect for the US, but now basically the US is the enemy. They're threatening the growth of China. So that has now caused higher energy in China, acceleration of technologies. And basically, you know, when you have trade, when you have war situations, having a well-defined enemy energizes you. And that is what's happening in China right now. So we're seeing an acceleration. And of course, if you go to China today, which maybe is very difficult right now, but you see significant changes in transportation, the high-speed rail systems. You can get on a train, again, if you're Chinese, with 3D facial recognition. You don't need a ticket. Basically going from Pudong to Nanjing, before it was 2 or 3 hours, now in 1 hour, 600 kilometers an hour. This is incredible. And of course, if you look at the use of smartphones for WeChat Pay, Alipay, and of course now they're bringing the digital currency, the rate of progress is very fast. And the young people in China right now expect progress to be also very fast.
Well, the numbers we look at here are hard to fathom. The latest number I've seen is that China has installed 700,000 base stations for 5G broadband and plans by 2024 to get to 10 million base stations. By the end of this year, the United States will have installed 10,000. So China's already at a 70-to-1 advantage in terms of installations. What does this disparity mean? Is it possible to bridge it? What are the implications of that?
Yeah, I think we also have to be very careful in terms of what we define as 5G. AT&T claim they have 5G. It's not really 5G, it's enhanced 4G. Right now you get the spectrum sharing, which is quasi 5G, 4G. So real 5G basically have very low latency. But what does it mean? Well, what it means is that China has decided that 5G is an important capability to improve productivity of industries. It can support telemedicine, digital health, it can support autonomous driving, also provide high definition content, but it's basically like having a high speed road system. So it's a commitment by the government to have that productivity capability. Here, what we have is we have AT&T heavily in debt. Also Verizon, basically, they were heavily in debt, committing initially to millimeter wave, which is the wrong technology. Basically, millimeter wave can give you short distance. You can't use it for the mobile user. You turn the phone, you lose it. So now Verizon is changing. Verizon is going to sub-6 5G. They have a new CEO. T-Mobile, with the acquisition of Sprint, is also going to sub-6 5G. So the US is now accelerating 5G, but 2 or 3 years behind, at least 2 or 3 years behind. So again, lower productivity for the users, less bandwidth, and basically we're not going to be able to bring in some new industries that need the low latencies.
Well, when we talk about the industrial productivity, medicine potential of 5G, do we need, or does China need a certain critical mass, a certain density of infrastructure to make that work? If you want to have autonomous cars, you can't just have a transmitter every mile or two. You have to have one every few hundred yards. What happens when you get to critical mass? What would China look like when they have this build out? What sort of things will happen?
Yeah, that's a very good question, a very good point. Having a few base stations, well, 700,000 is a lot, but it doesn't give China very good coverage in terms of even the smartphone users. But it gives you the ability to understand what the problems are in installing the base stations. There's some overheating right now, so they have to basically do some redesign. They have to basically shorten the range. So that's a learning cycle they're going through. But once you have it, you can then build these other industries very rapidly. And we're in a data age. Data to us is almost like currency. Every country has its own data, and you need to protect it, and you need to monetize it. And so the 5G is the transportation vehicles for that data. And of course, what the ultimate support for that data or analysis of the data is artificial intelligence. So you can look at all these different pieces, and maybe we're behind. It hasn't hurt us that much yet. But when artificial intelligence comes in, and you have this high bandwidth, low latency connectivity, you have all these services that are data intensive using it, it's going to be a black and white situation between the US and China, also Europe. South Korea, by the way, is in between. South Korea is actually moving quite rapidly also in 5G. It isn't just China.
So if I understand you, you say data is the currency. If I try to think of this in terms of the first industrial revolution, we had coal and oil, then we had railroads, then we had factories. So once you got the railroads up, all of the raw material was available to the factories, and you could get a spectacular increase in productivity. So if I understand you, once you have a certain density of 5G networks, then this massive data can be transported and ordered, and then it can go into the artificial intelligence engine and produce productivity results that most of us haven't even begun to think of. Could you give me a couple of examples of what that might look like?
Sure. So if you look at the use of oil, the use of electricity, we've built up large cities. We have, huge machines that move things, and that has occurred over 150, 200 years. So by having these basic capabilities, you can then build on them, and many new industries emerge. With artificial intelligence, the real turning point came probably in 2016, 2017. And of course, you have it on your phone right now in terms of better picture taking capabilities. But as you build the infrastructure, you're going to have industries coming in through the artificial intelligence world that basically will be dramatically different from what we have today. So what's an example? Example would be the fully automated factories, where robots basically produce everything. Robots will produce robots. So the supply chain will go directly from the raw materials to the end users. Logistics will then become also highly automated. Now, of course, when you do that, you also lose employment opportunities. So the other side of the coin is now when you lose all those employment opportunities, what do you do? So you have to build new industries. So what we then now see in China is the changing of the education system to have young children be coders, learning how to program. So you're going to change society significantly over the next 20, 30, 40 years based on artificial intelligence. And then the 5G is the foundation for the transmission of data. And of course, it's low latency, which means response can be very fast, and also large amount of data.
Well, let's take smart cities, for example. What I hear from Chinese industry people is that once the 5G network is built out, you'll have an artificial intelligence server in a major city, which will know where every passenger and every packet is and every vehicle, and it will be able to match vehicles to passengers and packages and move things and people around with virtually no congestion.
Well, yeah, I think and there are two parts to that. One is the existing cities have to be upgraded, and they'll have to, separate people and transportation. New cities they're building where the transportation is underground. So they have a number of examples of those happening. In addition to moving the packages, yes, they will be able to, or they are already being able to monitor movement of people. That is why they were able to control COVID-19. The 3D facial recognition is widely used now. You can dispute whether it's good or bad, but in some areas in China, they've shown that crime has gone down. But it basically makes shopping more efficient. It makes getting on the train system more efficient. The 3D facial recognition is one area that is heavily dependent on AI, and of course, very large amounts of data. And of course, that now feeds into the health system, where China has been way, way behind in health system. But I think in the future, I think you'll see a very, very advanced health system in China, monitoring people in real time. Of course, they will also monitor where people are. And there are some negatives to that. So anytime you have changes in technologies, you have to look at the social issues and accept some of the social penalties. And then you look at the benefits in terms of maybe greater health, greater mobility, and also potentially greater wealth. So the issue that the US also has to face is the strengthening of the Chinese companies becoming more efficient. You're not going to see a huge amount of movement of factories out of China for the high technology field because they're going with blockchain. they're going in with now with fully automation, high levels of automation, and high quality and high efficiency and low cost. And of course, less
Let's
people.
go back to the health issue for a second. In February and March, the favorite meme in the American media was China's Chernobyl moment. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in China convinced a lot of Americans that that would be a disastrous event for China. And contrary to the expectations, I think everybody I know in the United States, China appears to have successfully suppressed the pandemic, while the United States and Europe are subject to a devastating second wave. How important was this artificial intelligence revolution in dealing with the pandemic?
I think the most important factor in dealing with pandemic was the strict lockdown measures. And a lot of the initial activities in China were based on people testing the temperature of people and so on, but a very strict discipline in terms of movement and measurement and so on. And that was actually fairly people intensive. The new phase that we have today, though, is a bit different. In probably 9 months, now it's becoming a lot more based on the artificial intelligence, the 3D facial recognition, the monitoring of people, and in some cases tagging of people, which some of the Chinese have objected to fairly strongly. So initially it was very people intensive, but in a few months, 9 or so months today, it's now depending heavily on AI, still 4G, but I think in the next 3 or 4 years, you're going to see again significant increase in adoption of AI, and a system in China where the health system now can be basically world class. And again, this is changing, from a 5-year time frame to today. And COVID-19 was kind of a kick to make that accelerate.
If I could ask about the politics of this for a moment. Essentially, what you've told us is that the United States tried to slow China's dominance in 5G down. This united China in a sense of national resistance to an external threat. It really hasn't slowed them down. Secretary of State Pompeo offered a clean networks program to try to persuade America's allies and trading partners to exclude Chinese telecom producers, Huawei in particular. Just recently, we saw a report from a group of people largely in the Democratic camp, former Democratic officials, entitled Meeting the China Challenge, which said it's a fantasy, in so many words, to think you can keep Huawei out of the global system. There will be billions of Huawei users, so we have to accept that Huawei is going to be a major factor. Has the United States reached a point where it has to radically change its perspective and do something different?
Well, there are 2 or 3 issues here. One is what is happening, in terms of the global 5G. So I think the US actually has been very, very successful in either slowing down the adoption of 5G equipment or removing of 5G equipment in a number of countries. The UK is one example, Australia is another example. But a number of countries, some in Europe and other locations, have been waiting to see what happens with the election. And now that hopefully we have some resolution, they think that maybe next year there can be what we view as a more rational approach to the problem. The other issue is, who are the competitors of Huawei in 5G? So Ericsson is a good company, but relatively small. Nokia, again, relatively small. Both have new CEOs. R&D of Ericsson and Nokia combined significantly lower than the R&D of Huawei. So can they install 500,000 base stations a year, 1 million base stations a year that Huawei is capable of? It'll be a significant challenge. They will need significant funding. The other issue is, so far China has been on the defensive. When the US has attacked China, China has kind of taken the punches. Huawei cannot buy semiconductors products right now, except for a few exceptions. One was the exception given to Qualcomm last week. That's for the smartphone rather than the base stations. Intel has a license, AMD has a license, not publicizing very much. But basically, Huawei effectively cannot buy semiconductors right now. They have inventory, and that inventory is allowing them to continue to install the base stations. And we think they have enough inventory until maybe the middle of next year. So will China then allow the US to stop the US companies, European companies, South Korean companies from shipping to Huawei? We think no. We think next year China will go on the offensive because they cannot allow the US to what in some ways could be arbitrarily block the building of the 5G infrastructure in China. US can say there are safety issues, security issues, and so on related to building in the US. But does that then apply to the same thing in China? The answer, obviously, the logical answer is no. So next year, we think China will take the offensive, and they have a number of steps they can take. And one of the steps, of course, is the IP patent portfolio. Huawei and China has a very strong IP patent portfolio. They can actually block the installation of 5G from other companies based on that patent portfolio. Now, of course, it's going to become a legal issue, and there can be delays, etc. But there are a number of things that China will do, in our opinion, next year. So I think next year China will go on the offensive rather than just taking the pressure from the US. You also mentioned, by the way, that the US administration put tariffs on goods from China, and that was meant to slow down companies in China. Well, right now, the factories in China are full, backlogs to the middle of next year. The trade balance basically is still very high, over $300 billion this year. And of course, who's paying the tariffs? US consumers.
Dr. Jones, I know you had a few summary slides you wanted to show. Given how much information we're trying to absorb, it might be helpful to put them up now. And while you share your screen to bring up your presentation, I'd like to remind our readers that Asia Times is thrilled to be able to bring this quality of information to you. And we hope you will subscribe early and often. Like all of our competitors, Asia Times depends on our readers to support us. So please do subscribe, which will give you access to our premium content, the best inside depth reporting that you'll find on Asia anywhere in the world. So after that word from our sponsor, Dr. Jones, please go ahead.
Thank you. So these are some of the areas that we're analyzing pretty much in real time. We've talked a little bit of the 5G infrastructure. And yeah, I think we are seeing this rapid installation in China. 5G smartphones, these are the terminals that basically allow data to be shared, data to be generated. And of course, what we call them are the edge devices. And the level of capabilities in smartphones, of course, has accelerated dramatically. The new iPhones are really good. The new Mate 40 families of Huawei are really good. The new phones of Samsung are really good. But of course, in China right now, we see them being used as transaction devices. The Alipay, the WeChat Pay, and so on. As I said, also for buying goods and then also for transportation. Semiconductors is an area we track very carefully, very closely. US, if you look at companies like Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom, NVIDIA, AMD, a number of companies, still world-class. If you look at the manufacturing, though, TSMC probably is a year and a half ahead of anybody else in manufacturing for logic devices. Samsung is the leader in DRAM. Samsung is the leader in NAND. We almost have very limited manufacturing in the US other than Intel. Autonomous transportation is another area we track. Tesla has the best technology. And here in the US, we tend to be cautious about accidents and so on. China has some of the same concerns, but now they're actually promoting robotaxis. Also increasing emphasis on electric vehicles, which includes the supply chain of batteries. So there's a top-down approach to adopting autonomous transportation, which also ties into the high-speed trains. As I mentioned, the 600 kilometer per hour train, there's also one they're developing 1,000 kilometers an hour. Is it real? I don't know. But again, we see these big investments in the advanced technologies, which is very different from what we've seen in China in the past. Data centers is another area. The leaders today include Amazon, Google, Microsoft. China's coming up though. This is Alibaba, this is Baidu, Tencent. I think from an artificial intelligence perspective with data centers, we can say the US is 5 years ahead today. But in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it's going to be different. Digital health, we talked a little bit about that. The 3D facial recognition in terms of being able to today track people, but in future, you can actually look at some of the health characteristics by looking at the facial. Smart cities, David mentioned that, transportation of goods. Robots is an underemphasized arena. We see robots today as being in factory automation, but in future, home care for the aged, basically within many service industries. And what China is doing in robots is not only are they actually building, supporting the building of robots, but building the markets that actually adopt the robots. So if you look at the digital health arena, where they're going to be used robots for surgery, that is something that's being subsidized. So a lot of these industries are being subsidized. So this is a question of where does the government spend its money? Do you spend it on social issues? Do you spend it on technology? Do you spend it on building of industries? Where do you spend your money? And of course, we hear a lot about the waste in China. Yeah, there is waste. Many companies went into the solar cell business, and of course, many failed, but now they dominate the market. Same thing with LED. And we see other industries where the same kind of trends will occur. Yeah, there's a lot of waste, but there's also a lot of energy in China and a high level of entrepreneurship. And that combination of entrepreneurship as well as access to funding, that is one of the factors that is basically causing them to accelerate adoption of technology. Can the US beat them? Yes. What does the US have to do? Actually, not slow down China. What the US has to do is do what the US did in the past and basically support the growth of industries. So I think, David, if you have any questions, we can cover some of these points, or I can go to the next slide.
Why don't we go to listener questions, and perhaps you might want to refer to some of the slides going forward. First question, I think, that's the $64 trillion question. Under what circumstances, a listener asks, do you see China and the United States reconciling? Where in the US or possibly the Biden administration could there be a compromise to get to some kind of reconciliation and avoid the China strikes back scenario that you just outlined?
That's a very good question, and thank you very much for asking that. So what we have two issues or two perspectives. We have the political perspective, where we do have significant gaps. And will those be bridged? I don't think so. I don't think the US is going to change the political system. China's not going to change its political system. So no bridging there. Then you have the trade issues. And that's where we do think there will be a more rational approach to addressing some of the issues. The China market is very important for many companies. Many CEOs that I talk to are in horror because they don't know, will they have access to the China market in future? Will they be allowed to ship their equipment? Will they be allowed to ship their goods? And who can they ship them to? So we think China and a number of people in the US, or a number of people in China, a number of people in the US, want to resolve the trade issues. And we're cautiously optimistic that starting sometime in Q1 of next year, maybe going through the end of next year, we will have a more rational approaches to some of the problems. Now, we still have a huge trade imbalance with China. And so how do you fix that? Well, you can buy less from China, but that's very difficult for US consumers because there aren't any other sources for many of the goods. Can you sell more to China? Yeah, but again, what do we sell? We can sell more farm products and so on. So we have to build our industrial base, but we think there will be some more rational approaches to the trade issues next year. And the hope of many, of most, not all, but hope of many and most US companies is they have access to the China market, fairly open access. And then, of course, unfortunately, because we have no other options, we'll still have to buy many goods from China.
Let me abuse my moderator privilege and ask you my own question about this. About a month ago, we had a Democratic elder statesman, Congressman Barney Frank, on an Asia Times webinar, and we asked him what would the shape of a compromise possibly look like. His view is that the Biden administration would tell the Chinese, we will alleviate some of the restrictions that the Trump administration placed on tech exports to you on condition that you open up your market to more American companies. My question is, do you think China is ready to accept Google or Microsoft or Oracle competing for cloud business inside China or other areas which China has previously put behind the Great Firewall of China?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, data is becoming like currency, and you protect your currency. I mean, yeah, China has blocked Google. They have blocked the US data center companies. Yeah, I think there is a possibility that they will open up some. But even inside China, there are still restrictions on what Chinese data centers can publish. So it's a very managed economy. It's a very managed political situation. Are the Chinese people very unhappy about that? Some are, but basically overall, they seem to be satisfied with the fact that wealth is increasing. And of course, now they've actually got an enemy that they have to protect against. So we don't see that. We don't see a major change in that arena in 2021. You know, Biden has to show that he's strong. He can't just show that he is weak and basically he bows down to China. The same thing with Xi Jinping. So I think we're going to have some areas, and data is one of them, where there will be continued protection. And unfortunately, that's we think is reality for 2021.
Thank you. Ivan Wright asks, what does winning or losing look like between the United States and China? And what does that mean for the lives of most people, for ordinary people, you know, who aren't economists, but simply experience what happens?
Well, one measure of winning, of course, is wealth. Basically, are the wealth of the country and the wealth of the people increasing? Obviously, we're not in the stage now where food is hopefully not a problem. But I think it's also lifestyles, and I think the congestion in terms of roads, congestions in terms of moving things around. That's a measure of quality of life. So it's a question of a combination of quality of life and then wealth. And basically, what we've seen in terms of GDP of China, still less than the US. If you do some projections, maybe 2025, 2028, the GDP, total GDP might be high, but GDP per person would be lower. But it's really a question of the quality of life and wealth of people, and then also security. How secure are you in moving around your city? How secure are you in your home? So those are some of the metrics that we apply. Obviously, quality, the pollution, all those kind of things are also important. But it's basically quality of life and then wealth. Those are the two key metrics that we would use.
Peter Treadway asks, how can China succeed if it can't make chips? Of course, it does make some chips, but it doesn't have the advanced capability for the top of the line chips that are made by the Taiwanese and the Koreans. Um, what are the prospects for China's ability to substitute its domestic production for technology it may have difficulty sourcing under American controls?
Well, the new China, basically the high technology China, chips are essential. Chips are critical. And if they can't get chips, they will not be successful. So that's going to be one area of contention. We track the logic side. SMIC is producing 14 nanometers. They're trying to do 7, it'll be difficult. They can't do 5 because they can't get EUV. TSMC right now is in volume production at 5. YMTC is trying to do NAND. Basically, they're doing some low volume stuff, but they can't get close to competing with Samsung, SK Hynix, Micron, probably the next 5 years. Same thing with DRAM. Basically, nothing in terms of local production that can come close to what's available in the global market. So unless they get chips, they will not be successful in terms of 5G. They will not be successful in terms of data centers, digital health. The whole ecosystem that they are basically building depends on chips. And US is one key source. South Korea is another key source. Japan is a key source. Taiwan is an interesting situation because they need wafers from TSMC. And then, of course, Europe is important. So that's going to be one of the areas of strong contention next year. Can you block them from getting chips? And if the situation that has already happened continues, will China accept that? And that's what we think is an area where China will not accept. Yeah, they have to have chips, and they're far away from being self-sufficient in chips. The charts that we show, the analysis we show, this year of the chips they consume in China, only 20% are supplied by Chinese companies, 20%. 80% come from outside of China. And if you look at the advanced chips, it's like 100% for some of the advanced chips.
The China Challenge report that I mentioned from a group of people largely associated with past Democratic administrations proposed that the United States should sell finished chips to China as long as they're for non-military purposes, but not sell semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Could that be a compromise that everybody could live with?
Well, in terms of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment, in the US, we have leaders like Applied Materials, Lam, we have KLA, and so on. And they sell into China to companies like SMIC, which is lagging. Also, you have Samsung having a large factory in Xi'an, huge factory in Xi'an for NAND. SK Hynix has a factory in Wuxi. Intel actually has factories in China. They're selling the factory in Dalian, but they have an assembly factory in Chengdu. Yeah, if the US sells chips to China, actually China can then survive. China, though, feels that unless they can actually have the full supply chain, which maybe is 10 years, 20 years away, they don't feel comfortable because at any time the US can say no. And of course, it's not only the US that sells into China. As I mentioned, Samsung has big exports into China. A number of European companies have big exports into China. And then, of course, Taiwan. TSMC has something like 56% of the total foundry market. But if you look at 5 nanometers, only TSMC and Samsung globally have that capability. So are you going to stop Samsung? Can you actually stop them? Will the South Korean government allow that? So we have the political issues that in many cases are determining the trade issues. And but if China does not have access to semiconductors, if they can buy semiconductors, they can build the industries 5G, but they won't build their own semiconductor industry. And frankly, they can survive with that approach if there's guaranteed supply.
This is a fairly technical question from a listener, but I think it is interesting. the chips that Huawei uses in 5G base stations are not the 3, 5, or 7 nanometer chips that you get in the top of the line smartphone. They're 1 or 2 generations older. I think that the standard is a 14 nanometer chip. SMIC produces 14 nanometer chips. Is it possible that for, say, base station applications, China could produce enough of its own chips to continue its 5G build out and other things like that?
Well, in the 5G base stations and the infrastructure, you have what you call logic products, which are the processors, and the 12 nanometers or 14 nanometers is good enough. And of course, in addition to SMIC, TSMC has a factory in Nanjing that also produces 16. They're probably going to go to 12, and they want to go to 7. They want to go to 7. They want to get U.S. government approval to go to 7 in the next couple of years. But you also have the RF components, the gallium nitride, gallium arsenide, 3,5 compounds, and those are still not available inside China. So even if you can make some of the chips for the base stations and the backhaul communications, it's not enough. There still have to be imports. And some of them come from Europe, some of them come from Asia, but also quite a few come from the US. So just relying on SMIC will not allow them to build the 5G infrastructure.
Apropos, a listener from Europe asks whether you think that Europe might benefit from the US-China conflict, presumably by getting more market share.
You know, it's an interesting decision on the part of the leaders specifically in France and Germany. What do? From a German point of view, they sell many cars in China. Volkswagen is committing something like $2 billion or $3 billion now to autonomous driving electric vehicles. Mercedes-Benz is making big commitments. So the China market is very important for the European countries. We actually had discussions with the French government, Department of Industry a few weeks ago regarding this issue. What do? And of course, the decision has been wait until the election. And let's see in 2021, can they have a rational discussion on what kind of collaboration can exist between the US and China? I mean, there are concerns in Europe regarding what they view as China becoming too strong. So there are concerns in terms of, you know, the political issues as well as the trade issues. But there are significant increased opportunities for Europe to gain from China. Yesterday, actually, I talked to a high-level person in one of the big European companies who just returned from China. He came back on Sunday and visited many places in China. So we had a long discussion yesterday, and they're allowed to, based on the analysis of the requirements right now, to actually actively collaborate on development of new technology with China.
Could I suggest we unshare the screen now to get back to, so we can, our listeners can see it better. Thank you. Going back to your China Strikes Back thesis, a European listener, Wilhelm Eichmann, asks, can and will China use its advantages in the field of rare earths to hit back against the United States?
Yeah, that's also another very good question. Of course, that is one area where they've threatened already, and that's an area where they basically have significant leverage. The other area, of course, is in the chemicals for the medical field. Also, in terms of the vaccines, yeah, they have a number of areas where they can strike back. And as I mentioned earlier, they've taken a very defensive position so far. And if you basically look at China history, they're very good at strategies, very good at strategies. And the leaders in China, if you look again at their history, they've got to the positions through basically winning. In some cases, they have some advantages. but they really have demonstrated the ability to outperform competitors. That's how they've got there. It's not a democratic system the way we have. It's a brutal infighting system where there are many casualties, but the winners basically tend to be pretty smart, and they will use strategies, and that's one of the strategies they will use. So as I said, we're very, very, very strong. We feel very strongly there will be an offensive approach, and rare earths is one of the areas, and there are multiple areas. But again, how they will do it and what kind of, there's also the expectation on our part, they'll have to pay a price. There has been some IP stealing. Companies, in Silicon Valley have also done some of that, but there's been some IP stealing. There's been some unfair trade practices. So there have to be a price. Is it $10 billion? Is it $20 billion? So we think that's going to be on the table also next year. And will they pay it? I think so, yeah.
Dr. Jones, this is a question more on military than industrial strategy. So if you want to demur, I'll understand. But John Derbyshire asks, apropos of your statement that Biden has to show he's strong and so does Xi Jinping, his question is, will Xi be able to resist the generals and popular push to attack Taiwan? Does Xi Jinping want to attack Taiwan?
Well, that's a very, very, very complex question, and there are clearly, when you track what's going on in China right now, there is the building of anti-US sentiment. There has been the building of some potential taking stronger actions towards Taiwan. Is it really political bluffing? Are they real? I don't know that. But it's going to be on the table. It's getting more on the table. Hopefully it doesn't happen, because that could be disaster for China as well as the US, at least from the areas that I track. But again, I think hopefully in 2021 or even for the next 10 years, that does not become a major confrontation. China has tried to limit or to weaken the competitiveness of Taiwan companies in a number of areas. Displays is one example. Foundry was another target, but of course they failed completely with TSMC. And other areas, Taiwan with 24 million or 25 million people is an amazing country, absolutely amazing. And then the other one that we think is amazing is Israel. If you look what Israel is doing in AI, way ahead of the US in many areas related to military. So again, we have to wake up. Basically in the US, we have to become a lot more aggressive in terms of our activities in what we view as the advanced technologies. And I've been involved in the past, in my past background, I was involved with military. At the time, we were maybe one generation behind, maybe half a generation behind the commercial side. Today, we're basically 2, 3, 4 generations behind. And we can fix that. That is fixable, but it means a different mindset. So that is one area. If we look at what Israel has done, basically, if we emulate some of the stuff that Israel has done, we'll actually be so much better from a military point of view than we are today.
Well, apropos of your comment, Frederick Sung asks, do you see any signs that the United States is systematically capable of identifying and making the investments in future industries similar to what China is doing? It seems that the idea of industrial policy is still only given lip service. And absent such a U.S. turnabout on industrial policy, is China the betting favorite to become the foremost technological power?
Well, U.S., there's a proposal right now in Washington for what's called CHIPS, is to accelerate the building or acceleration of the technology in semiconductors in the U.S., including the building of factories. Is it likely to be approved? Maybe 50-50 right now. To build a factory for 3 nanometers, you have to invest 15 billion or more. Is that money going to come from the government? When we've talked to government officials, they cringe. They say, well, we'll have 1 billion, maybe 2 billion. If they can give it, they can support Intel and so on. That's one option. But again, Intel will need the technology, which they don't, in some areas, which they're still missing. So yeah, I think US in the past made investments in advanced technologies. So we do have very big government funding, but we don't seem to have the mentality that we have to invest in technology to build the future. So we had Bell Labs, we had the IBM research organizations. We were the leaders in technology for many, many generations. That mindset has gone away. And so we need some leaders in Washington, some industry also, to raise the profile of technology. So hopefully by looking at China and seeing where China is going, we say to ourselves, let us not try and slow them down. Let us accelerate what we do. And because if we don't, as the listener mentioned, they will be the global leader in many areas of technology. And the one that we're most concerned with is artificial intelligence, because that goes into the military, it goes into many, many areas.
A number of listeners have asked about 6G. There are people in the present administration who say, well, we're not going to fight China on 5G. We'll go directly to 6G and leapfrog them. Should the United States do this? And what indeed is 6G? I really don't know what it is. If you could tell me, I'd be very grateful.
Well, China has at least 2 or 3 programs in terms of 6G. And we've actually had discussions with the head of one of those programs. It's a 10-year program. And basically it's going to be potentially 10x or 100x higher throughput than 5G. Quantum communications is one of the options. And they actually have already a link between quantum communications between Shanghai and Beijing. So yes, US should go to 6G, but who's going to do it? We have nobody, we don't have any company in the US today doing 5G. Basically, we have some of the infrastructure, but not the base stations, not the backhaul communications, not the fiber optic stuff. So globally, we have Huawei, we have ZTE in China, some in Datong, but very weak. In Europe, we have Ericsson, we have Nokia. Samsung is now coming up. Samsung could be a force in that market in the next 5 years. Some technology in Japan, but the US, we don't have anybody, any company that is even in 5G. So what should we do? Europe has established, Belgium has established IMEC. IMEC is very, very strong in many areas of technology. Their revenue is going to be close to $1 billion, which is amazing. Yeah, we should set up research labs with commercial leverage, commercial market potential. So we have to create the market for 6G. And it's a 2030 probably target. I don't think it's going to come in before 2030. And of course, there are going to be multiple variants of 5G. Millimeter wave 5G for closed environments, short distances is okay, but not for the average type of smartphone user or even for autonomous driving. Yeah, I think we should have these programs. We should have these reach for the moon programs, because the US has a lot of talent. But it's not being focused on the right areas today, in my opinion. And we should build a manufacturing base as well as a service base. I'm a very strong believer in manufacturing, because that gives you the basic technology to apply the technology to the end markets. And it also gives you control over the supply chains.
Pius Franco asks how you see the alignment of world powers with respect to China. For example, the United States put enormous pressure on its allies not to let Huawei in. This is still an open question in Germany, from what I can tell. Japan declined to join the US so-called Clean Networks program. I believe South Korea is still allowing Huawei telecom equipment in their 5G program. How do you see this shaping out in terms of America's ability to build such a coalition?
Yeah, that's again a very interesting question. And we do see increased power in Asia right now. Again, the areas that we focus on involve manufacturing. So we see Samsung and we see TSMC. So we're seeing this kind of shift in power from a technology, which will then in future also give you political power. So, are we seeing like the decline of the UK in the US? Are we seeing basically Europe also in kind of a decline phase and the growth in Asia? Hopefully not, but the latest trade agreement that was signed last week indicates more collaboration in Asia. And if there are large markets in Asia, I mean, if you look at China with 1.3 billion people, if you look at Indonesia, where India will go is going to be key. I think India is going to be a really key country in terms of the power. Europe, I think, from what I can tell, is still fairly closely aligned to the US from a political point of view. The political systems are fairly similar, but again, companies want the China market. So you have the conflict between the political situation and the industrial situation. But as the industrial power changes, the political power will then also change maybe a few years later. And that, of course, what happened with the US. US initially became an industrial power, and then you became a political power. And of course, underlying that is military power. And that's going to continue to be important for the next, for the future.
We're reaching the end of the hour. We have time for one more question. But before I ask it, I'd like to remind you that we're very grateful to all of our Asia Times subscribers for supporting us and making our work possible. For you, those who haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. You can click on the subscription link at asiatimes.com. We will be grateful for your support, which we need to be able to continue events like this. The last question is a very simple one. That's the Thucydides trap question. Why can't the United States accept the rise of China? What would it take in the American mentality to accept that China is irreversibly a new major power and in some ways on par with us, in some ways perhaps not?
I think the people in the industrial field, they understand the rise of China, and they understand the markets for their goods in China. I think within the political environment, I think it's basically vote getting versus, and I think in terms of some of the people in the political environment that have been to China, and we actually do communicate with some of the consulates in China and so on, there's a very good understanding that China is rising. And the concern is, will they damage us in the future? And then if you think they're going to damage us, then you try and block them. But I think there's really the building of the understanding that China is gaining traction rapidly. I think for us, what do we do about it? As I mentioned, trying to slow down China, blaming China for different things is not the way to win. That's not how the US was successful in the past. That's not how European countries were successful in the past. The way to be successful is to be better than competition, and China's a competitor. And again, having good competition is good if you actually recognize the competition and then you modify your strategies to win against competition. And that's what we have to do.
Well, Dr. Jones, thank you for your vast reservoir of information and for your wisdom on these matters. We're very grateful to you for taking the time with us, and also very grateful to all who participated and asked sharp and pointed and difficult questions. With that, with my thanks, we'll end the webinar and hope to see you again before very long.
Thank you for having me. And thank you very much for the questions. I really appreciate them. Thank you.
Thank you. And good day, good evening, good morning to everyone.